Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Welcome to a review that's been long in the offing. Many of you who follow the Ginger Nuts of Horror may have noticed my review of Mark Matthews' The Hobgoblin of Little Minds recently, which I kind of rhapsodied about. I really did. It's the kind of horror that I seek out, that I ache to find. It really is. Horror is such a general term. It's such a vague term in many respects. It incorporates so much. I mean, describing something as horror, sure, some people will have very particular reactions and they'll think they know what that means. They think they understand what the classic tropes and themes and subjects of horror are, but it's rarely that simple. It is rarely that simple. Not only are there so many subdivisions and subgenres and traditions that incorporate horror and indeed horrific material, but which are not always categorized as horror. There are also even deeper subdivisions. I mean, one thing that happens quite often at the moment in sort of independent horror is that you get this strange division, this cultural division between what is considered to be the literary and what is considered to be the pulp, and that is really strange to me. I've never really understood that tradition. A lot of my fiction tends to be called literary horror. I don't really know what is meant by that. If I'm perfectly honest, I don't understand the difference. Insofar as I can see, it's often the case that what is considered to be pulp horror can be as clever, socially reflexive, culturally aware as what is considered to be literary horror, and what is considered to be literary horror can be as reactionary, can be as flagrant and overt as what is considered to be pulp. It's a really strange and rather synthetic division, I find. That said, there is a definite distinction between horror that is more traditional, that treads sort of the well-trodden road, which conforms to particular traditional templates and archetypes and concerns itself with that exclusively. And that is not a condemnation, by the way. I'm not disregarding that kind of horror. There is so much space for the well-trodden road. There's so much space for the well-told traditional horror story that follows all the tropes, all the templates, that has all the familiar elements but is well done. There are numerous examples of those out there, and I really like them. In independent and small press horror publishing, there's entire swathes of that. There are entire collections and anthologies dedicated to that. But for my personal tastes, for me, and this is entirely subjective, I will always go for the horror that pushes it, that doesn't tread the well-trodden road, that actually takes the alternative path that veers off into the woods, you know? I like horror that elevates the conversation, that takes the tropes and the subjects and the traditional themes of horror and either lampoons them or subverts them or uses them to broach different issues than they traditionally have. And that's exactly what Mark Matthews has done here. The Hobgoblin of Little Minds is as much a story of psychology, mental illness, there's even a science fiction element to it, and even a cultural commentary, as it is a werewolf story. Now, I've seen it described as a werewolf story quite a lot, and I find that I understand why that label has occurred, because it does indeed involve certain forms of what I suppose could be considered lycanthropic transformation. But for me, that kind of reduces it in a very sincere way. What Mark Matthews has done is taken the familiar elements of the werewolf and has both dived into the origins of that mythology and also extended them. He's extended them to refer to postmodern cultural phenomenon, to entire other fields. So, for example, he's extended the phenomena of lycanthropy into the notion of mental health and psychology, which is it's a fascinating thing to do with any kind of traditional horror subject, and certainly with traditional horror monsters. So in this book, the werewolf is not a supernatural creature as such, although it has elements of that. There's more an element of psychological and genetic engineering to it. But what I love about it is that Matthews doesn't describe the werewolf or the characters who experience those transformations as alien or as monstrous. In fact, what he describes them as is emblematic of a kind of essential humanity that has been forgotten, an atavistic animal humanity that has been forgotten. He also uses the traditional characteristics of lycanthropy to refer to notions of mental health and mental illness, but it's not a simple examination. This is something I will sing the praises of the book for forever, quite frankly. And any story that does this, it is not the case that the lycanthropic characters are all just mentally ill. That would have been a ridiculously simplistic and frankly rather offensive thing to do. That is not what Matthews does here. If anything, the close focus, the character focus, is upon those individuals. It's upon them, and they are the most sympathetic, the most interesting, the most complex characters in the entire thing, in the entire story. What Matthews paints is a grey, grim and grimy world. It is so acutely of the now. What Matthews captures is that sense of overwhelming decay that we have in our cultures, in our politics, in our societies. And there is a fantastically healthy rejection of cultural prescription, of the systems that make us sick and command us to be well. That's what he's drawing here, essentially. He is condemning the systems that impose and inflict sickness upon us, that destroy any sense of ourselves, of our mental health, and then condemn us for that sickness, that then command us to be well, demand that we are perfect, demand that we are pristine. No, Matthew says no. This story says fuck you, all right? It's a really angry book. It reads underneath the surface level of the story, there is this incredible anger at culture, at society, and the way it treats psychology in general, the way it treats notions of mind. I mean, it's not even as simple. I mean, I described it before as being about mental health and mental illness. That's too simplistic as well, because what Matthews does is he wouldn't even describe it as mental illness, what these characters are going through. He would simply describe it, and does in the book, as alternative forms of psychology, alternative states of mind that are not worthy of condemnation and in fact can take on their own kind of animus. That's what's going on here. The so-called mentally ill characters in this book are the ones who come at least to know themselves via the lycanthropic transformation. They come to know who and what they are. They gain a wonderful state of glory, almost a kind of abhuman celebration. It's a way of celebrating the monstrous, and this is something I adore in horror in general. It's when it takes subjects that traditionally have always been marketed as being horrific, grotesque, unpleasant, unworthy, and it explores why they're attractive. This is done for the vampire all the time. In fact, it's done for the vampire ad nauseum, and often in very narrow and unpleasant ways. Very often with the vampire, what happened? The vampire is very often the abuser. So you look in things like Twilight, for example, and the vampires, the so-called romantic vampires in that series are the abusive characters. But they're celebrated, they're enshrined as though they're beautiful and wonderful and semi-angelic. The werewolf often doesn't come in for that. The werewolf has remained an icon, generally speaking, an icon of bestial grotesquerie. Something it's indicative of a loss of control that goes hand in hand with the themes of mental illness that are bound up with it. There's also a misogynistic element bound up with the werewolf as well in certain respects, when you consider the symbolism of the moon, the cycles of blood, menstruation, that are all part and parcel of the werewolf myth. This basically takes all of that and shatters it or inverts it. The werewolf characters, it's not unambiguous. They are bestial and they are violent and they can be grotesque. They can be absolutely inhuman at times. But they are compared and contrasted to a world that has not even apologized for, but has enshrined and justified certain kinds of violence, that has bound those kinds of violence, the systemic violence and the cultural violence, into itself and normalized it. And what Matthew says here is, yeah, these characters can be monstrous, but so fucking what? So what? Compared and contrasted to the systemic violence that they receive, that informs their psychological state and that is inflicted on everyone else in this book. Almost everyone else is a victim of these forms of systemic violence. What the lycanthropic characters do is nothing by comparison. Absolutely nothing. And not only that, the violence that they inflict it's not justified, but it's often an expression against those systems of control. You know, they are doing it out of desperation. They are thrashing against the shackles and the leashes. They are lashing out against their abusers. I mean, one of the most interesting things in the book is that it takes characters that would otherwise be the antagonists, and which kind of are in this book, but it provides them backstory, it provides them not justification, but an explanation. We understand why the antagonistic characters believe as they do and are acting as they do. They are victims in and of themselves, just as much as those that they inflict their particular kinds of abuse on. Like the main character, the main antagonist, Dr. Z, who is kind of responsible for the creation of the lycanthropic characters, is in many respects an abuser. In no uncertain terms, she is an abuser. The characters that she inflicts these transformations on they're not in their right minds when they subscribe to it, when they agree to it, and she knows that. What they're put through is agonizing and unpleasant on a physical and psychological level, but she's kind of right. Towards the end, she's kind of proven right in a certain way, in the sense that these characters are not monsters. They're not monsters, regardless of how culture and society want to paint them. In fact, they are in many, many respects better creatures. They're better human beings than the vast swathe of humanity, than the prescriptions of humanity that culture provides. And I kind of love that. I've got to say, I will love the book forever for that. It is not a simplistic read. And people who come to this book expecting it to follow certain templates or certain dance routines, they're not going to be happy. They're going to find it jarring. They're going to find it difficult, because it doesn't allow you to get away with that. It actually doesn't allow the reader to get away with the simple answers. The characters aren't simple. None of them are angelic. None of them are absolute heroes or villains. There isn't a clear-cut end to the mythology, because the mythology is a bleak one. You know, it's a mythology that exists in desperation, and as a reaction to a culture and societal systems that are not only sick but are cancerous, are coming down. That is something that Matthews paints throughout. The society that we believe is so absolute, that we assume to be so absolute, it's latter years Rome. It's coming down. And what the werewolves represent is not only a return, it's not as simple as a return to sort of a previous state or to a more atavistic state. It's actually an ascension to another condition by which humanity might continue in a better way, in a manner that will not allow for these systemic abuses, these enshrined inequalities. It's a very, very interesting, heavy, dense read. I will say this, it's incredibly triggering in a very real way. It deals with so many dark subjects. So you have mental health and mental illness, which is a profound subject in this book, and is clearly from a place of personal experience, because it's so real. It's so real. The descriptions of things like depression, suicidal despair, the altered states of mind that occur throughout this book, which are border on the schizophrenic at times and then just leap over it. The manners in which those frames of mind are targeted by authorial abusers, so people who have enshrined authority within society, and target victims of mental illness as their victims. That happens a lot in this book too. There's familial abuse, there's harm to animals. There's a lot in this book. There's a very unpleasant portraiture painted of institutions, hospitals and asylums of doctors and whatnot, particularly those of mental health, for better or worse. There's a hell of a lot going on here. A hell of a lot. There's the familial stuff in particular is very strong and very fractious. It is not a simple matter. You have here abused children who identify so strongly with the parent who is ostensibly responsible for that abuse that they can't function without them. They go looking for them, even though they've been in absentia for so long, and find incredible answers to the mysteries of their lives. It's very, very fraught and beautiful in that bleakness, but God, the dirt and the grit, the psychological realism is very, very profound. And I imagine people coming away from this feeling quite unhappy. I imagine this book will elicit certain experiences and emotions that are not pleasant, yet at the same time it does have this quality of not celebrating but providing a kind of catharsis for these experiences. It's quite brilliant in that regard. It's the kind of horror I will go for again and again and again, and I think Mark Matthews has done a brilliant job with it, an absolutely beautiful job. So I will leave links in the descriptions, guys. The Hobgoblin of Little Minds, links down below. When we come back, we may do another book review actually, because I'm rather enjoying this. So thank you, Mark, and thank you guys for listening. Until next time, bye bye.